it's just preparing. Yeah. So we're live, I think. Yes. Okay. So we are live. So okay. So thank you, Professor Jones, for coming to this webinar of the French Center for Research on Contemporary China in Taipei. So hello, everyone. Welcome, everyone. So good morning or good evening to everyone that is watching our webinar online. So I'm very happy to have Andrew Jones, Professor Andrew Jones, today on our lecture series on Chinese and Taiwanese music here in Taipei. So of course, Andrew Jones is a professor in Chinese at the University of California, Berkeley. He teaches modern Chinese literature and media culture. He's the author of several books on music and culture in the Chinese-speaking world, as Like a Knife, Yellow Music, or Developmental Fairy Tales. He also translated 2 books of fiction by Yu Hua and a volume of literary essays by Ailan Chong. So for this webinar, so we're live on YouTube. So if you have any question, you can ask the question on the comment section in YouTube. I will be monitoring the comment section, so feel free to ask the questions. I will be sharing it with Professor Andrew Jones. So again, thank you, Professor Jones, for coming today from California.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So I will be we will be having a discussion on your last book that was published in 2020 at the University of Minnesota Press, Circuit Listening. So Chinese popular music in the global 60s. So you can find it on the University of Minnesota Press and in the library near you, of course. So it's a very insightful and very influential book, I think, on music in the Chinese-speaking world in the global 60s. So we will be talking about this fabulous book, of course. But first, I want to ask you a question about the genealogy of this book. So I think it's part of a trilogy on music that you began with Like a Knife, ideology and genre in contemporary Chinese popular music. So it was more on rock and roll in China in the 80s and 90s. Then you published another book called Yellow Music, Media Culture and Colonial Modernity in the Chinese Jazz Age. So it was more about Shanghai and the jazz culture in the early 20th century. And now you published so this book, Circuit Listening, in the global 60s with examples of music circulation in China, in Taiwan, and Hong Kong. So my first question will be on why did you choose this particular subject, so the global 60s in the Chinese-speaking world?
Okay, great. Thank you for the question. Well, I never set out to write a trilogy. That was completely unexpected. The first book, Like a Knife, really came out of my first interest in listening as a methodology of trying to understand a culture and a politics and a historical moment in China that I was sort of immersed in as a student at Beijing University in the late 1980s, a long time ago. And so at that moment, I kind of encountered the emergence of the Chinese rock scene and tried to understand it and with the tools that I had then at my disposal. And then later on, I decided to sort of go back in time, to time travel, and to understand the emergence of popular music in modern China. And that took me into the jazz age, or a kind of globalized jazz age that bubbled up out of the colonial city of Shanghai in that period. And this new book, this third book, well, I want to say maybe the 2 different origin stories. One of you just mentioned that I've translated Yu Hua's work, and Yu Hua is actually besides being a celebrated writer, he's also a music fan, mostly classical music, but he's very sensitive to sound and to musical phenomena, which I think is one reason we got to get along. Um, so he kind of uh, castigated me and said, "Well, why don't you do another book about red music? You've already written your yellow music. Why not red music?" So I kind of filed that idea away, and thought, yeah, it would be a good idea to do something on the kind of the mid-century experience of music in the Chinese-speaking world. So that's one point of origin, but um, maybe just as important is the global 60s part. Not so much the Chinese music, but the global 60s part. So originally, I was really fascinated by the fact that really throughout the world, and I talk about this in the book as well, that throughout the world, in starting in the early 60s and accelerating into the late 60s, you have this kind of explosion of constellations of new forms of popular music that are often sort of synthesized between rural sounds and electric sounds, right? So I could point to, Tropicalia in Brazil, or High Life in Nigeria, or reggae music in Jamaica, Cambodian rock music. It's everywhere. It's this kind of universal global phenomena. And that really fascinated me. So it got me thinking about how we could think about not just a 60s that takes place in Berkeley, where I am tonight, or in Paris, where I know you've spent some time as well, but outside of the metropolitan areas and in rural areas, or in the so-called global South. So I'm not sure I'll ever write that big book about everywhere all at once in the 60s. I find it's usually more effective to try to, you know, um, focus in on one place, or dig deeply in one particular kind of soil, and maybe that core sample can show you something about the world as a whole. So what I ended up doing is kind of merging those two books: the book about red music or revolutionary music in the 60s in China, and a book about how that might relate to the larger global picture of um, music that was really transformed by something that happened in the 60s. And then the question becomes, what happened? And why is there a distinctive 60s sound across so many different locations?
Thank you. Um, yes, your book, in fact, used the metaphor of the circuit to understand this circulation of music. So the circuit listening is also the circuit of the radio, the wave, but also the closed circuit of the radio in China that, in fact, was protected from the outside world. So how did you find this metaphor working for the global 60s? Is that like a new kind of technological progress that will, in fact, have an effect on the circulation of music and ideas?
Yeah,
That's
so that kind of gets to the core of that question I just asked, which is, well, was there such a thing as a 60s sound, or was there some reason why we get, say, uh, I don't know, a revival of folk music in the US that then turns into rock and roll at the same time that folk music is rediscovered in Taiwan, at the same time that, say, local folk traditions in northeast Brazil, like in Bahia, are incorporated into this raw psychedelic rock sound. So what's going on? Um, what's the common denominator there? Um, or even more locally in the sort of Chinese speaking world, why is it that, you know, we have very, very different kinds of music across the boundary between China and Taiwan, but somehow there may be interesting commonalities nonetheless. And so one of the common denominators I found, not so much in mainland China, but certainly outside of it, is that the 60s was a time of green revolution where a lot of rural labor was rendered obsolete, and there was a lot of movement, especially in the third world, from the countryside into big, massively growing cities like Lagos or Taipei or Kingston, or we could go on for a while naming all those cities, right? And I think that created, in metaphorical terms, a new kind of circuit that links up the rural areas with the cities in new ways that creates really exciting kind of cross pollinizations or um, new circuits for musical production. So that's one of the answers
Mm.
I came up with. But the other one is technological, which is, if you had to talk about what makes the 60s sound like the 60s, um, the more I listened and the more I did research on that period, the more it seemed to me that it was really the transistor circuit and its popularization as a kind of underlying technology for musical dissemination and also for music making that really changed the sound of pop music and other kinds of music as well in this period. So um, the transistor circuit was basically invented in 1947 in the US by Bell Labs. And it took, vacuum tubes, um, which were kind of heavy and kind of hot and usually required you to plug into a wall. So they're not very portable. And they're actually kind of expensive too. Um, and like, yeah, so I've this old radio behind me. It's a old, vacuum tube radio. So it's actually pretty heavy and it's not portable at all. But once you have transistors, which are basically semiconductor circuits, um, they're radically smaller, they're radically cheaper, they're radically cooler, and they can run off of a lot less current. So basically, even if you don't have electric mains in your village, you can listen to a transistor radio or play a transistorized record player, or maybe even set up a transistorized loudspeaker network without a lot of energy. Um, so again, yeah, one of the common denominators here is that the transistor kind of changes rural life forever. Um, in mainland China, even in the late 60s, less than 10% of the countryside was electrified, right? But the whole countryside was plugged in for sound. And how does that happen? It's actually because of transistors and because of their ability to run cheaply on very little current. Um, and at the same time, outside of mainland China, there was a kind of, I call it a kind of domestic appliance revolution, whereby because transistors were being produced more and more cheaply, often in precisely a place like Taiwan that became one of the world's largest producers of circuits and still is famously. That's why it's a bone of global contention in part, even now with the TSMC integrated circuit factories there. Because of that, there was a huge new economy in kind of domestic appliances. And just as transistors allowed China to be wired for sound from a central state-run radio broadcast that was wired, in places like Japan or Taiwan or of course the developed West, transistors allowed a new kind of both portable sound as well as domestic kind of appliances for the consumption of pop music, right? So felt like although the social and political outcomes are very different, the underlying technology of the 60s was really the transistor circuit, which kind of became cheap enough and widespread enough by the late 60s to be everywhere. And yeah, the other thing we can say about it is it really changes the sound of music. So it's kind of an axiom in rock and roll studies, for instance, that the transistor radio that started to be produced in Japan and then Taiwan and then reached the US in huge numbers by late 50s, early 60s, kind of fix the sound or transform the sound of the pop record, like with Phil Spector, who designed his engineering in the studio to sound good on a transistor. The Beatles, a lot of Motown works really well on a small transistor radio or through a headphone. So we talk about that kind of stuff in the kind of historiography of Western pop music. But I was also curious, well, how does that work in mainland China? And started to try to understand the ways that, revolutionary music was actually also very deeply imprinted by the medium that it was coming through. In this case, really cheap outdoor speakers that were powered by often, transistorized generators. Yeah. So it is very much in part a kind of technological revolution that changes the sound of the 60s.
Yeah, and on that, so on mainland China, as you were mentioning about, so also the transformation of red music, red songs, with a broadcasting station. So you were talking about in the part called Quotation Songs. So the wired network, of course, as opposed to the wireless network. So how also the state is running this network that is supposed to be free flowing. And you are quoting Chongqing during the Cultural Revolution, which I find the quote very interesting. So it's during the Cultural Revolution. She's talking about music, and she's saying they're wearing red stars and waving red flags, but they are swing dancing. They may as well be naked. So it's this kind of danger of music that Chongqing is talking about, the danger of swing dancing and the moral behind music. And in fact, we are finding it in the Chinese part of the book, but also in the Taiwanese part. You are talking about the hippies that were not allowed to come in Taiwan. So with this banner at the airport in Taipei, so we are not accepting hippies in Taiwan, and also the fact that from the 50s and the 60s you had the KMT policemen that just cut the long hair of the youth in Ximending. So you see that even in Taiwan and in China, you had this kind of problematic relation to music, pop music, and youth culture.
Right. So I think, yeah. So another, I guess, kind of driving force for this book as I was writing it, you never know exactly what shape or what kind of stories a book will tell until it's done. Um, but I think each chapter is basically predicated on a record that I found crate digging. I like looking in record stores. And we have pretty interesting record stores here in the Bay Area. There's a pretty big Chinese population here, but also there used to be a lot of, 60s radicals who are interested in Maoism, as well as a pretty big population of servicemen for the US Army that came back from Vietnam and brought a lot of pirate records back from Taiwan, right? So, so a lot of the records I wrote about were kind of finds that I found in the record bins here, and one of them was, this record that's called "Quotations from Chairman Mao," set to music, right, from 1966. And of course, I'd heard a lot of red music, but I wasn't at the time I found this record very knowledgeable about this particular subgenre of red music, which is quotation songs. Basically, short, punchy, fiercely repetitive songs that are based on, and actually were written in order based on the Little Red Book, or the Quotations from Chairman Mao. And they started coming out in 1966 at the very beginning of the Cultural Revolution, and then were banned by Jiang Qing, who took, umbrage at these songs, but only after they'd been kind of circulating through the country for 3 years. But so what is she talking about when she says, "Oh, it's like swing," and why would she take offense at that? Yeah, I thought about that a lot, and I also thought about these songs as I listened to them, because one thing that happened to me listening to them, and I'm sure it happened to all the Red Guards and young Chinese students who were listening to them back in 1966, is I found them intensely catchy. Um, you can't help moving your body along with them because they have this kind of very strong meter, a very strong pulse. And they're based around very catchy, melodious quotations set to music, such that it's almost impossible to get the things out of your head. And I found that, both annoying and incredibly intriguing, right? So I kind of ran a thought experiment, I guess you could say, that I think to some listeners or some people remember this era with horror or with fear, will find a little bit cognitively dissonant, which is, well, what if we think of these quotation songs as not as propaganda but as pop, right? Um, and I actually think they are pop music because they're engineered for maximum stickiness,
Mm.
right? They're earworms. Um, and they were extremely popular. People really liked them. They would do dances to them. They would learn how to play them on an accordion, how to sing them in groups. They became actually quite ubiquitous for a time. And the core audience for this kind of music was young people. It was actually young people who were idealistic and out there trying to make revolution or continue the revolution. Often high school students, even middle school students, up to college students. So, okay, you have 2 minute long songs that appeal to people from like roughly, 12 years old to 22 years old, that are highly catchy, that are aggressively idealistic. In what sense is this not pop music, right? Of course, it's not partaking of the same kind of commercial economy that the Beatles or the Rolling Stones were. Um, of course, it's coming through a government or state run network of publishers and of loudspeakers, very different from, say, I guess, EMI Records or Capitol Records that were putting out the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. But at the same time, the AM radio that were playing the Beatles are just as ubiquitous in some sense as the state-run wired network in China. So I guess I started to find the analogy not quite as far-fetched as you might think. Yeah. Um, and Jiangqing taking, objecting to these kind of records took place after 3 years of youth revolt across China. And whatever we think or how we want to, posthumously understand the Cultural Revolution, I think it's fair to say that there was a great deal of youth revolt taking place. There was factional warfare, but there was also a great deal of dissatisfaction against teachers, institutions, schools, bureaucracy, all of that kind of stuff. So um, there is, in a very different context and with a very different kind of politics and under a very different kind of institutional background, you do have some interesting analogies, at least, between, say, the New Left in France or the US and some of the youth movements that were taking place in China. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're talking in the book about a song from the movie of Jean-Luc Godard, so the La Chinoise, the Chinese, and it links between the two. There is a link between the Maoist period and this song in France, talking about the Cultural Revolution in China. So we can see that it's a global phenomenon, in fact, that is linked. So, yeah, by
Right.
the
Yeah. I
circle.
mean, so that's one of the one of the ways that I kind of play around with the idea of the circuit, right? That it's clear that China, mainland China, the PRC in this period was in a lot of ways it was a closed circuit in terms of its media system, and definitely a closed circuit in terms of um, the scope of free thought or ideological contention, right? There actually was a lot of struggle and contention, but it all had to take place under the red flag or under the using the language of Chairman Mao, right? So it's mostly a closed circuit, although of course arguably there was some input from other socialist bloc countries into that circuit, right? But at the same time, well, even though, say, Paris in 1967 and Beijing in 1967 are radically different worlds, there are still some circuits that join them together. So one of those was the Guoji Shudian, which was basically the global propaganda arm of mainland China in that time, which produced records that translated the Little Red Book and the works of Chairman Mao and sold them worldwide. So here in the Bay Area, in California, it's quite famously there was like one store called China Books and Records in the Mission District in San Francisco. Um, and I guess, yeah, a lot of my kind of predecessors at University of California who studied Chinese all had FBI dossiers because they used to go there to buy dictionaries or Chinese literature. They're completely, maybe studying pre-modern China, completely apolitical, but the FBI had a observation station across from that bookstore to kind of take pictures of whoever went in and went out. But one thing that did happen was that a group of young black radicals who became the Black Panther Party in Oakland figured out that if they went to China Books and Records and bought lots and lots of copies of the Little Red Book for, say, 25 cents a copy, then they could go to Sproul Plaza on the UC campus here at Berkeley and resell them at a profit to sort of white leftist radicals. And, those kind of book sales started to fund some of the, breakfast programs for kids in the ghetto in West Oakland, that kind of thing. But also, Huey Newton and those kind of young, curious, smart activists started to read the Little Red Book and started to be inspired by particularly the parts that talk about anti-imperialism, colonialism, that kind of stuff. And of course, you had similar things happening in Paris in the run-up to 68. And, Jean-Luc Godard in that film, La Chinoise, I think somewhat parodically makes a film about a cell of young, Maoist radicals in Paris who, quite ironically, are living in a very well-appointed bourgeois apartment building in Paris, but kind of imbibing a lot of Chinese music, radio broadcasts, and records, just like this. I mean, I'm sure they had this record, and listen to it. So that was a kind of interesting, I guess you could call it a global socialist circuit that extended through shortwave radio and books and records from Peking to Paris, yeah, or Peking to Berkeley, yeah. So that was a one aspect of, or how I finished the chapter about quotation songs, is talk about how they extended into these pockets of youth radicalism or radical chic in the West, yeah. And like Godard, I'm sometimes a little skeptical of how much of that was real radicalism and how much was just performative. Yeah.
Moving away from the Piracy, I'd like to talk about another secret that you are speaking about in the book, which is in fact epitomized by Grace Chang. So in particular in her movie Hair Hostess, so and we see another secret in the movie of non-communist Chinese-speaking word. So she's playing a hair hostess, and she's going to every part of the Chinese-speaking world that is not communist, and singing. So you have, of course, Taipei. She's going, of course, from Hong Kong to Taipei to Singapore and Malaysia. So that's another very interesting thing in the book. I think is the other the other secret, not the communist one, but maybe the anti-communist one, and epitomized by this movie. So can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, that's. I think this was actually the first piece of the book that I wrote. And one of the things that I'm trying to think about, if we take the metaphorical or kind of methodological meaning of circuit, or circuits, I should say, they're plural. One of the ways that I entered into thinking about this was actually thinking about the long history of what's called, sometimes called Black Atlantic music. and the way in which Black music genres have kind of circulated from West Africa to Cuba and Jamaica and the Caribbean, and then uh, up to places like New Orleans and New York and London, and sort of, you know, well, the metaphor is circular, but there's definitely a kind of circular circulation of these musics, and they move back and forth as well, such that, for instance, early records of Cuban rumba were vastly influential for the development of West African um, music and music in the Congo. So there's a lot of reciprocal movement, right? So that musical circuit, I think we could arguably say it lasts about 300 or 400 years and is still going strong. So they're very slow, long historical circuits that create kind of musical interchanges, even across oceans. Um, so I would say that Grace Chang, or Gelan in Chinese, um, when she makes this film in 1959, Air Hostess, she's actually kind of plugging into a circuit that had existed for quite some time, and which is a circuit which kind of radiates out, I suppose, if you want to be sinocentric about it. And I'm not sure I want to be, but it radiates out, or has as the central node, Shanghai and then Hong Kong, probably particularly Hong Kong, and then the kind of Southeast Asian areas that were became centers for the Chinese diaspora. Um, so that'd be, you know, Thailand, uh, Sumatra, Indonesia, Singapore, of course. Further afield, places like Honolulu and Hawaii, yeah, and the west coast of the United States. So that's an older circuit that I think arguably dates back at least into the 1920s. So, you know, for instance, the so-called father of Chinese pop music, Li Jinghui, does a tour of Southeast Asia in 1928 that's hugely successful, largely because his daughter, Li Minghui, is already a movie star at that time. So it's a kind of filmic and pop music circuit that exists. And so Gulan in the late 50s kind of plugs into that circuit. But that circuit has even more energy, I'd say, in the late 50s and early 60s because of the contention between so-called Red China and so-called Free China, which is, you know, as you said, China outside of the ambit of, you know, the bamboo curtain, the so-called bamboo curtain, or you know, and by which that time Taiwan, of course, had been very important as a destination as well. So the movie, as well as Grace Chang's career, kind of resonates in that particular circuit. And in the movie, she's a stewardess and she travels by, you know, jet plane, I guess on Cathay Pacific, or um, one of it's probably Cathay Pacific, from Hong Kong to Bangkok to Singapore to Taipei, yeah, and kind of argue that in the chapter that if we want to listen to Grace Chang, I guess we can associate with her with Hong Kong, but she doesn't really belong to any one particular place. She speaks in perfect Mandarin because she herself was from Nanjing via Shanghai, and she kind of plugs back into the earlier Mandarin Shidai tradition from Shanghai. Um, but also, if you listen to her records, well, she sings calypso, or some version of calypso, which of course comes from Trinidad. She sings mambo, which some version of which comes from Cuba. um, Her music sometimes draws on music from Taiwan, sometimes from Southeast Asia. So she's very hard to kind of locate in any particular place. So the term hit me at that point that, you know, we can't really listen to her as being static, right? We always have to listen to her within a circuit that extends across almost a whole global map, right? So not just Hong Kong, but Trinidad and Cuba, not just Hong Kong, but also, you know, Shanghai, not just Hong Kong, but also Taiwan, right? Not just Taiwan, but also Southeast Asia. So I was kind of trying to create rewrite Grace Chang as a sort of topographical map of a history of the way in which music has circulated, across the globe. Yeah.
And that leads me to another question, which is in fact on the foreign influences on music, particularly in Taiwan. So we're going to focus a bit on Taiwan because you are talking about, of course, of jazz that was imported by the military, the American military in Taiwan, with the several bases, air bases across the island. And also, what really interests me is the Filipinos' influence on jazz music, because Filipinos came to Taiwan to play in these bars for the American soldiers, and they were really they influenced Taiwan music because when they came with jazz music. You can see the same thing in Hong Kong also. The Filipinos came to Hong Kong to work in the bars and to play in these bars, jazz music. So you have all these different kinds of influences, many in Taiwan, of course, with the Japanese influence during the Japanese colonization that had a profound influence on the Taiwanese music. Then you had the Americans that came with the military, and it also they also came with rock and roll music. So we had previously a talk with Xiong Yiping, which wrote a book on the Chinese rock and roll music in Taiwan in the 50s, since the 50s, and he says that rock music came with the militaries, the GIs, and also with through the youth, the KMT youth, so the children of the militaries that came from China. And in fact, they were one of the major component of the rock and roll circuit, because they were more free than the Taiwanese youth. Because their dads or their family were militaries, and they were open to this kind of music with the military bars in Taipei. So it's really an interesting kind of multi-factor influence between different countries and different people. So just to focus on Taiwan, what can we say about these foreign influences and the way it shaped the Taiwanese music also?
Yeah, that's fascinating. There's so much to say about it. First of all, about rock music in Taiwan, a great example of that is Edward Yang Detong's film A Brighter Summer Day, which is really a portrait of mainlander youth growing up in Taipei in the early 60s. And for them, they have access to record players and to foreign connections. So Mao Wang, Elvis Presley becomes really important to them in that moment. You can also see this in writing by like Chen, who writes about the 60s in Taipei, and it's the rich KMT kids who have American records. They're really expensive, for one thing. Actual zhenban, like actual American issues of records, were quite expensive. So one of the things that I wanted to do with this book actually is kind of counteract a tendency I saw in a lot of scholarship to celebrate globalization or celebrate free circulation, or even to discuss circuits of cultural consumption as if they were free or open or equal. They're not, right? So I'm very clear throughout the book that different circuits have different power sources. And if your circuit is powered by the United States, well, it's going to be a lot more resonant. It's going to have a lot more amplification than a circuit that's powered, say, by a marginalized linguistic majority in Taiwan that speaks Taiwanese, but doesn't have the levers of the state or educational institutions or media institutions. It's going to be much less amplified, right? It'll have a lot less power. So circuits are hierarchical, and sometimes that manifests itself linguistically. So that in Taiwan in the 60s, Mandarin, and even above Mandarin, English as a medium of musical expression had a lot more prestige than Taiyu or Hakka, or let alone the various indigenous languages of Taiwan, right? So I kind of wanted to in the book make that clear, that these different circuits can be mainstreamed by political power, and they can be marginalized by political power. They can be mainstreamed by policy and marginalized by deliberate policy suppression. And that's really what happened in Taiwan with these various circuits. So to take up again the Grace Chang story, she and her work was able to, I think, circulate very freely from Hong Kong out to the rest of free China. And a lot of that had to do with the lingering sort of prestige of Mandarin. She sang in Mandarin, and Mandarin traveled with a passport across all of these diasporic spaces. She was also really well capitalized by a big film company called MPNGI, also known as the Cathay organization that was based in Singapore. But also later on, her record came out by Capitol Records, the same company that was marketing the Beatles in the United States, as well as a series of kind of world music records, including Sakamoto Kyu's Skiaki, which became a huge hit in the US in the same period. So she had a lot of capital and linguistic backing. And so she'd sing a calypso song or a mambo song, and it could become a hit across a great geographical space. That doesn't mean that Taiwanese musicians weren't also dabbling in mambo, right? But their audience, their capitalization, the record companies, and their political position within Taiwan was marginalized to the extent that they just didn't have as much purchase. And they spoke mostly to working class local people rather than kind of more aspirational middle class, as we see in Grace Chang's audience, or at least her imagined audience. Yeah. So that's a huge difference. And within that, as you mentioned, there was also a lot of interesting and somewhat, I think at the time, somewhat invisible migratory circuits, like you mentioned the Filipino influence, or really the crucial role of Filipino musicians and dancers in Chinese pop music at this time. And that actually goes back quite some time. There's an interesting dissertation by Fritz Schenker about kind of the Filipino music industry and Filipino musicians and their migrations, which I highly recommend. And he traces it back to the 1930s. And indeed, you can find this phenomena in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, even in the 30s. Because a lot of those musicians were kind of riding on the steamship lines between Japan, Hawaii, the US, the Philippines, sometimes India, Singapore, etc. Yeah, so Grace Chang, for instance, learned dancing from a Filipino dance instructor in Hong Kong. So her mambo girl phase was actually, in debt to that. One of the innovators of swing music in Taiwan, Xie Tenghui, he also learned some of his stuff from Filipino musicians, and also in Thailand, actually. So yeah, I think the story of Southeast Asian involvement in this music is still, more needs to be told and more research needs to be done for sure.
And you're talking about language, which is really interesting because you have a huge part on the Taiwanese language music with Wenxia, which is one of the most prominent musician, but also actor, because he did movies with music. And what I'm really interested also what you're saying about Wenxia running the venues. So he's going throughout the Taipei to go to each theater that shows his movie and perform after the movie. So that's another circuit of Taiwanese music, which is not wired or wireless, but more about going from live venues to live venues, or from movie theaters to movie theaters, to promote kind of Taiwanese language music, which is slowly disappearing at the time with the KMT coming to Taiwan. So that's also a really interesting point in your book. It's language and music language, and the disappearing music, and also movies on Taiwanese language.
So yeah, when Wensha is he's still with us. I think he's what 93 years old now. An amazing man, and of course in Taiwan he's known as a kind of guobao, or national treasure, which is interesting, of course, because it does show the power of territorial or linguistic circuits. What I think you probably can't find anyone in China who doesn't know who Deng Liqun is. I would be hard pressed to find any people in within the PRC space who know about or listen to Wen Sha, right? So circuits can be very, very divided by linguistic barriers. And in particular, Wen Sha, as you know, grew up in Tainan before, during the Japanese colonial period, and Japan and Japanese music is one of his main frames of reference, as well as, of course, local Taiwanese music. So that's another really interesting and kind of constitutive circuit in Taiwanese popular music, is the sort of the circuit that was connected by Japanese colonialism and the colonial period in Taiwan. So there's lots of fascinating things we can say about Wen Xia. He was like Hong Yifeng, another major Taiyu performer. He was both a singer as well as a filmmaker and a film star. And unfortunately, we only have one of his 10 movies extant. So one of the chapters in the book is based on the great work of the film preservationists and film historians at the Taipei Film Archive, or Taiwan Film Archive, I think it's now called, who found and kind of restored his last film, Zaijian Taipei. So I sort of approached his story and his music through the lens of that film. But it turns out, as you mentioned, that film was really essential to his whole commercial and performative model. So in those days, he would make a film, and because there were only a couple prints of the film, they could only afford a couple prints of the film. What they would do is show the film in a venue. At the end of the film screening, do a performance of the songs from the film, and during that performance, the print would then be sent to the next movie theater across town. The film would be shown while they're doing the performance, and then they would then drive to the next theater, and it's called Paotangs, or running the venues, something like that. So yeah, this really fascinated me because it defies our expectations of what media culture is like and how it works, because there's this kind of intimacy between the mediated Wensha and then the Wensha who performs on stage and has an immediate connection, not a mediated, but an immediate connection with his audience of Taiwanese speaking, often new urbanites, that is, people migrated from the south in Taiwan to Taipei, or migrated from the countryside to Taichung, or the countryside to Kaohsiung, to these burgeoning industrial spaces of the city. And that kind of connects to another theme of the book, which is that oftentimes, if you look at media studies in the Anglo-American Academy, a lot of early media studies books kind of theorize how media worked based on an idea of media that was sort of developmental and assumed that media works, right? That the networks were well funded, that they functioned well, that they were coherent. And, anyone who has spent some time in remote rural areas or in poorer places know that's not true. That's not the case. So Brian Larkin, who's an anthropologist at Columbia University, wrote a book called Signal and Noise about media networks in northern Nigeria. And his whole critique was just what I've mentioned. I've borrowed a lot of his thinking here there, that, media networks in northern Nigeria were characterized as much by noise as by signal. They often fell apart. Sometimes they were counterfeited or pirated. Sometimes you had to steal electricity to run them. And they definitely didn't respond to the sort of logic of, primitive going to advanced in a straight line at all. So what interested me a lot about Wensha and about that kind of co-presence of media and actual performance was just that. It's like, you don't really think of a movie industry that's so small scale that it relies on the intimacy of a performance at every single screening, right? That's very odd. But it gives you a sense of the diversity of different kinds of networks and different kinds of circuits as they developed in the 60s, right? And we should remember that Taiwan, apart from a fairly privileged group of urbanites, was still pretty poor in the 60s. Mainland China, even poorer. So just for fun, another great example of this kind of unexpected media networks that I found when I was researching the book was when I was looking at the loudspeaker system in mainland China. Basically what happened there is in the late 50s, the government decided, well, we want wired broadcasting. We want the voice of Peking to be linked to everywhere in the country, but we don't have the funds to, give localities the money to do this. So we're just going to say, do it. Find a way to do it. So basically everywhere across China had to scramble to come up with ways to innovate, to put in these new wired radio networks that could extend from village to village to village, right? So how are you going to do that? Well, people have to figure out ways to do that. How are you going to power the networks when you don't even have local generators? How are you going to find enough wire to set these things up? Well, transistors made it a lot easier because they're really cheap. But in looking through the actual documentation, there's lots of really fascinating kind of, they call them 土办法, like, earthy solutions or local solutions. One day I was looking through a book from like Northeast China, I think Liaoning province, I forget, but I think it was Liaoning province, like how to set up a broadcast system in your local village. And I kind of learned how to read a little bit, at least circuit topologies. So I was looking at a circuit topology that was being provided to local cadres to set up a network. And I was looking at the diagram and I was like, there's something really weird about this diagram because there's a picture of a cow in the middle of it, right? But that's exactly what was going on. It was a loudspeaker system that was powered by a generator that was linked to livestock that were turning around and around to kind of power up a 2-watt system that could reach a couple villages, right? So again, you have a sense that, yeah, media don't develop necessarily in the ways that we think of when we think of like RCA radio in the United States or, NBC or, Radio Rediffusion France or whatever it is. Yeah. So that's another kind of theme of the book, I think, is about uneven development in the 1960s. Yeah.
Yeah, and speaking about uneven development, you have also a part on piracy, which is something else, but something really important for the development of this kind of music and the circulation of music, which is also another underground, a way, or not so underground for some cases, way of circulating the music. So in Taiwan, with the Germany, so hot music or hit music that were in fact vinyl produced by Taiwanese company, but with it was basically piracy. So just copying vinyls that were imported from the US or Japan, and in fact we can see that this kind of pirate circuit that in fact lasted for a long time, because after in the 80s and the 90s in China, it was also through piracy that they had this kind of discovery of Taiwanese and Hong Kong music, particularly Teresa Teng, so Dong Li Jun, that you also talk about in your book. She came into China through piracy, and also like foreign music came also through other means. So you have the Daco, so Joran de Clout talks a lot about that. But like this kind of other network of or underground network of piracy is also essential for your book and the comprehension of this musical circulation and this musical secrets. So it's another kind of secret also.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So, here, this is one of my favorite images from the book, which is a 1967 pirate record from Taiwan of Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And you know, it's kind of funny because it's misspelled. It says Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and then you know, 1967年 the Beatles. um, and this, yeah, I mean, this speaks to uneven development. I think this one was from Black Cat Records, one of the many pirate companies in Taiwan. So it speaks to uneven development. It speaks to uneven prestige of different languages, and also the differential of technology, as well as the kind of military influence that you mentioned earlier, in with respect to rock and roll. So the whole story of pirate records in Taiwan is a complicated one. In the book, I trace it mostly to the presence of the U.S. military in Taiwan. So a lot of the business of selling pirate records came about because local entrepreneurs sensed an opportunity to get original records. They're often brought in by stewardesses. Speaking of Grace Chang and air hostess, and then you know within a month or a few weeks, they could be cheaply pirated in Taiwan, and the cost then would plummet. So a real record, you know, like a real copy of Sergeant Pepper's would cost anywhere from 10 to 100 times more than the pirate version. So that's one origin, that there was a ready-made market of U.S. servicemen in around places like Taipei, Zhongshan Road, or the military base in Taichung or Tainan or Kaohsiung. Yeah, the naval base in Kaohsiung. Another source of this trade, actually, which I don't go into as much in the book, but was also important, was the prestige of English. So a lot of early pirate records were actually instructional records in English, like instructional tapes, how to learn English. And there was also a huge pirate textbook industry in Taiwan, which was very, very important for people to learn English, but also to learn trades, to learn technical knowledge, to learn science, etc. So all of that came out of a huge economic and prestige declivity between the United States as a kind of massive neo-colonial presence in the life of Taiwan, and local people and local cultures, right? So in terms of the pirate industry, it had some really interesting unintended effects. One is that as this pirate record industry grew, the GIs weren't a big enough a market. So the market extended to include, you know, a lot of young people, college students, casual listeners, urbanites who wanted to be hip and who wanted to hear what's going on in the US. So by late 60s, these records were sort of circulating not just among GIs, American servicemen, but to villages in southern Taiwan, brought back by the cool uncle who went to work in Taipei and then brought them home. So suddenly people were listening to The Doors or Otis Redding or Bob Dylan in places like Meinong, southern Taiwan. And here I'm drawing on an anecdote from Zhong Yongfeng, one of the great songwriters and poets in contemporary Taiwan, who works with Lin Shengxiang, who remembers very clearly, when I think his cousin or his uncle would bring back Otis Redding records. You'd hear this very novel sound of sitting on the dock of a bay, or Light My Fire by the Doors. And it kind of really transformed his soundscape and his synapses, how he thought about the world too. And that was all an effect of pirate records. Those records would literally be unaffordable if they hadn't been pirated. A lot of people also, back in the 60s as well as in the 70s, even in the 80s, would say, hey, don't criticize pirate records. If there weren't pirate records, there would be no classical music culture in Taiwan either, right? No one could have afforded to learn Brahms, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven. That was the main conduit for a generation of aspiring musicians, or people who had been forced to, learn piano or violin by their aspirational parents, right? So it's a very, very important story of a circuit that was opened up by the military as well as by the prestige of the US, and then led to both the craze for remaking, hit music or hot music, but eventually then started to form the ears and the aspirations of the generation that innovated the new campus folk music movement in the 1970s in Taiwan, right? Either through being exposed to like Joan Baez and Bob Dylan, or later things like, James Taylor, as well as rock and roll, Van Morrison, Jefferson Airplane, whatever. Yeah, all of those records sort of were grist for the mill for young people like Li Shuangzi, who became really important in the formation of campus folk in Taiwan.
Yeah, talking about the campus folk movement, in fact, in your book, which is the late 70s, so not precisely in the book, but you talk about another folk movement, which is the rediscovery of folk music in Taiwan with Chen that was rediscovered or discovered, and the folk music tradition that had more or less an impact on the folk music, campus folk music movement with the discovery of Chen, which is really interesting because I was thinking about that. You're talking about Xu Zhonghui, who rediscovered Chen when he was doing like ethnography on the rural soundscape of Taiwan. And in fact, in the book at the end, you have an appendix where you translated a small part of his article about listening to songs in the streets of Taipei. So in fact, it's really interesting, this part, because he's going out in Taipei, and he was kind of searching for sounds in his environment, and he didn't hear any folk music, Taiwanese folk music or Taiwanese ancient music. He was listening to when he woke up. His neighbors were listening to Japanese pop songs, and when he was on the street in his bike from Sheda or Taida, near the Taida neighborhood, he was listening to pop music. So he was saying that it's not like in France, where he was studying, where people are singing their traditional folk songs. So it's really interesting because, well, I live near Taida, and I was, this morning coming to Academia Stica, and I was not listening to any sounds. Maybe he was listening to military sounds, also military songs in the schools. And well, it's really interesting to see that because of modernity, you wanted to go back to this kind of folk music tradition, which is also recreation, like any tradition. So it's not, it's always something that you recreate. So this part of your book is really interesting about the rediscovery of Taiwanese folk song. I want you to talk a bit about Chenda and his rediscovery if you have time.
Oh yeah, of course. This is actually the longest the longest chapter in the book, and probably one of the most complex stories, I think, in a lot of ways. So, part of the background to this, I suppose, is that for anyone who's a scholar, even sort of deeply interested in the development of American music or English music in the 1960s, the whole story of rock and roll in the 1960s, you'll know, of course, that the Rolling Stones played blues, or that they recycled American blues and then sold it back to America, right? Or that, in particular, that a lot of older blues musicians in the American South who had been playing and recording in the 1920s and 30s, like Lead Belly or Mississippi John Hurt, were like in the late 50s or early 60s, they were rediscovered by recordists or ethnomusicologists who went and kind of found them in remote villages and then discovered this amazing kind of link to an older American music tradition that they wanted to revive. And hence, that's at the root of the American folk revival. It's at the root of Bob Dylan, who started playing that kind of music because he heard the Harry Smith's Anthology of American Folk Music. Yeah, so it's really like at the root of the historiography of what happened in the 60s in Anglo-American pop music. So yeah, when you come across the story of Xu Changhui, a Taiwanese composer and musicologist who taught at Shida in Taipei, kind of narrating the fact that in 1967, as part of a folk song collection movement, he found at the farthest tip of the island of Taiwan in Hangchun Peninsula, an old blind yueqing player. And as soon as he started playing, he started crying tears of gratitude and joy because I found the missing link. I found the roots of, our folk music. It's an incredibly compelling story and a really interesting story to mull over. And yeah, I think part of the story has to do with what I was talking about earlier. How do we re-narrate the 60s as a time of increased traffic between rural areas and urban areas? How do we narrate as a time when, because of rapid urbanization, there's a certain like cultural nostalgia for the backward, the forgotten, the left behind in time, the non-mediated, the glossy sort of music from the past. And I think that part of that is really taking place with Xu Changhui organizing this movement to rediscover and catalog Taiwanese musics in the rural areas, but also being so utterly swept off his feet by Chen Da's music. I mean, he's right. He had great taste. He had great ears. Chen Da is amazing. But there's also a heavy ideological yearning that's engaged by his, discovery of Chen Da in 1967. And, Chen Da eventually is brought up to Taipei. He performs in a kind of hipster club called Deltauren in Taipei. He's mostly kind of ignored by most people, but he does eventually become an iconic figure of Taiwanese identity, as well as a sort of iconic figure of the campus folk movement, especially in its earliest phases. So that's part of the story. But the other part of the story I tell is kind of has to do with Xu Changhui's initial frustration, which is that he can wander a whole day from early in the morning to late at night through Taipei, trying to hear people singing. And it's only late at night in the most deserted corners of the city where he actually hears what he thinks of as being organic folk music. The rest is all recorded music. So what really bugs him is the media, the mass media, commercial music, records, radio, all of those things that were really newly ascendant in the 60s in Taiwan because of the cheapness of transistors and radio sets and record players and all of that kind of thing. So he's kind of trying to rescue music from the media. Ironically, however, in order to do that, he ends up making records of Chen Da's performances. And that's where things get really messy, because Chen Da and his musical style doesn't lend itself to LP records. It doesn't lend itself to radio. It doesn't lend itself to TV at all, right? As I'm sure a lot of you know who are listening, Chen Da was a musician who could just endlessly improvise. He told long folk ballads, or he'd just make up his own as he went along. Biographical stories of how he used to, work on a sugarcane plantation in Taidong, or stories of love and revenge in his village, whatever it was. So in order to kind of make him fit on a record, you have to cut him down to size, or cut him down to a song format. And what happens when you do that is some of the essence of his music is just lost, right? Also, a lot of the timbre or the unique vocal intonations of his music are lost when you notate them into written form. So yeah, a lot of the chapters about that kind of tension between urban and rural, between mediated music and, more organic live performance of music that we found with a figure like Chen Da. Yeah. And then there's one last twist. I'm sorry if I'm going on too long, because it is a longer chapter, but there's one last twist in the chapter, which is Shu Changhui and some of his colleagues, like Shi Weiliang, who was another musicologist in this period, who also recorded a record of Chen Da's, claimed to have discovered him, right? And discovery was a big part of the narrative. And particularly, there's one song, 四想起, or Remember When. It's a kind of narrative mode for telling a longer story about whatever. It's open-ended in the beginning. They also claimed in recording Chen Da's version of that they had kind of found a classic tune in a particular repertoire that was local. And what they didn't realize, or what they didn't really want to mention, is that song, and actually a lot of the repertoire, had already been discovered and already been covered in multiple versions by many, many local singers. It's just that they didn't like the fact that it had been made into pop music already by singers who were working in Taiwan. So one of the important figures here is Shu Shi, who was a kind of a musician who also wanted to kind of draw on folk music, but make it into a hybrid kind of pop music that drew on both orchestrated music, but also swing and, nightclub based sort of music. And he was a very popular composer of Taiyu Gechu, right? As well as a composer with aspirations of creating a very local idiom that was in dialogue with folk music. So his form of using the kind of compositions that Chen Da was singing were kind of written out of the narrative for quite some time, in favor of a discovery narrative where something pure and unadulterated and unmediated is discovered. But in fact, Chen Da had already been transcribed by Shu Shi as early as the late 1940s. So the discovery in 1967 of his music was in fact quite belated. And there's another history of a local Taiyu circuit that is not celebrated, and in fact is kind of written out of the record in Shu Changhui's writing. Yeah, so it's a pretty complicated story about different circuits and different kinds of mediations between country and city and between live performance and records. Yeah.
Maybe I'll turn to the questions by the audience. Yeah. So we have one question by Alice. So I'm going to read the question. Thank you for this fascinating talk. I had a feeling that we can currently observe a sort of nostalgic revival for these musics of the global 60s in China or in Taiwan. For example, plastic vinyls from the Cultural Revolution have recently appeared in some shops in China. There is also a revival of record stores selling old records in Taiwan. is that a phenomenon that you paid attention to? Do you think your work can be seen as part of this larger, renewed interest towards the historical significance contributions of the global 60s? So just I have a vinyl that I want to show also that appeared in the record store. The vinyl produced during the Cultural Revolution, which is a bit strange because it's really you can fold it and you can still listen to it. In fact, even if the sound is not really good. So there is also a revival of this kind of objects in China right now.
Yeah, so those are, I guess we call them flexi discs.
Exhibits, yeah.
Here in the US and anyway, yeah, they were actually produced in massive numbers in China in the 60s because they're cheap and light and portable. In fact, more people had those than actual vinyl records. Yeah. Um, Heijiao, Changpian. But yeah, in answer to your question, I'm old enough to have grown up with this stuff. So for me, I guess I'm sort of more of a native to vinyl culture and a little bit, I find, streaming services and the whole digital ecology a little bit um, uh, more alien than the old sort of analog culture that I was reared in. So for me, yeah, I'm like a generation after the 60s. I was born in 1969. So I suppose there is a certain nostalgia for me of going back to an era, just I guess my parents generation in that era and kind of exploring it. Although I certainly overlapped with that period. I would say that there's a lot of the nostalgia now, and we see this also with the revival of young people buying vinyl records or record players for the first time after becoming disillusioned with Spotify or or with the comparable streaming services in China like Xiaomi or whatever it is. I think there's a difference there, which is mm, in my work, I am interested in the 60s as a time of possibility and also as a time of actually a great deal of developmental aspiration, which is always belied by really deep injustices and really deep disappointments, whether political or economic. So I hope that I'm not really doing this work to commodify that era, but I certainly do want to hold it up as a mirror to our own historical present. And I think all historical work in one way or another is trying to do that, to think about the reference value of an era, about 50 years ago, in this case. In terms of the sort of upsurge of interest in vinyl records or the musical culture of the 60s in Taiwan and China in particular now, um, some of this I think is a commodification of that era where it just starts to signify as style, and people aren't necessarily yet able to understand the complexity of those times. Some of it may be digital fatigue, and I certainly feel that as well. That Spotify algorithms bombard us with music, but they don't necessarily give us the time to develop an intellectual or even an affective or emotional relationship with music. So I think people are beginning to prize once again the materiality of records and the slowness of our relationship with records, right? That you can kind of get to know a record over time, that you can sort of incorporate it into your life and, well, possess it, actually. I don't think with Spotify or streaming, you necessarily possess music in the same way. And that can have its positive aspects, I think, to collect or to develop a relationship with an artist through the mediation of an object. Yeah. So I think that's part of the nostalgia. And well, maybe it also speaks to that sense of possibility that I also found in the 1960s. Of course, it's possibility deferred or betrayed, but um, certainly in the last in the last few years, in whether you're in Taiwan or mainland China, we're living in a very tense period. We're living in a period that seems overshadowed by a lack of hope or by terrible apprehension. You know, whether that's of ecological collapse or the sorts of problems that have been brought to us by the pandemic. Although I guess Taiwan and China have Taiwan even more so than China have suffered less immediately from the pandemic than a lot of other places in the world are still suffering. Um, but certainly it colors our apprehension of the future, right? And then finally, of course, more locally, mm, these days in Taiwan, especially, there's a shadow of conflict or impending conflict of the possibility of war. I don't think I'm being overly dramatic to say that with the, almost daily sorties of fighter planes over Taiwan's airspace. So yeah, in a sense, maybe a time of possibility and youth emancipation that the 60s stand in for can give a sense of another world or another kind of future. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I
that might,
think we can
yeah.
see that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So nostalgia for the 80s. The revival of disco, maybe in China or Taiwan.
Yeah.
You have also this kind of nostalgia for a past that was more open, more filled with opportunity and possibilities. Yeah,
Right, right. No, and that's definitely the case in I think the recent revival of sort of Japanese city pop. Some people call it yacht rock. That it has that kind of buoyancy of an era in the 80s where it seemed like the economy could expand forever and the good times could roll without any kind of, shadows on the horizon. Yeah.
which in fact tells us that nostalgia is not always reactionary. It's also about changing the possibilities of the present by looking at the past. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I hope that's the case. I hope
Mm.
that's the case. Although I think it runs the risk of flattening our historical understanding of the like internal diversity of each period, right? Because that's also one of the things I was interested in the book. It's like, wow, you can take the same year or the same day in 1968 and have radically different realities, whether, depending on whether you speak Taiwanese or Mandarin, whether you're in, a destitute village in Guizhou or in, you know, Zhongshan in Taipei. And yet some of the same sounds are still circulating in the same air. Very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and also I just want to add something on the records and the physical records,
Mm,
which is something that I'm interested in, and these days it's important for me because having these records, like this collection, also is important because some of these songs are disappearing. If we rely too much on the internet, you have censorship on the internet, and you have a lot of songs in China that are disappearing now because from the Chinese internet, but also from our collective memory. So we have to construct this collection, these archives, through physical records, because otherwise it will disappear. So it's
yeah.
important for us to collect this kind of records.
That's a fantastic point, and I couldn't agree more. One of the really interesting things about records as objects is, of course, they're not just musical. Um, you can read entire histories from the object itself. Like, for instance, in the book, I talk about a pirate record from Taiwan of John Lennon's first solo record. Right. And the single off of that record was a song called Working Class Hero. which has very leftist lyrics. And when the record was pirated in Taiwan, all of the song titles are translated into Chinese, except that one, because I think some KMT censor thought, or maybe just the record company itself thought, well, that sounds too leftist. We're not going to translate that one. Working class, 工人阶级的英雄, whatever. That's not going to work. So you wouldn't know that if you were just listening to the John Lennon record streaming. All of that would be gone, right? Or you can see like histories of ownership where people write their names or put their individual stamp on records. Even listening to the grooves, you can tell which songs got listened to the most because they're the most scratchy. Right. So there's a lot of information that's subtly imprinted on the material object and can be really important for research. Yeah.
Yeah. I have another question on the comment section. So from Zev, thanks for the great talk. You've talked about the global sound of the 60s being driven in part by the physically grounded functionality of the transistor. Was there also a look of the 60s that was globally driven by the physically grounded vinyl records covers and the illustrations that they made possible? Have you looked at visual aesthetics of records?
Yeah, I mean, I have to a certain extent. And I'm pretty interested in that. And I kind of trace some of the covers in both senses that come up in Taiwanese music of the 60s. That is covers, 翻唱 or cover versions, but also the covers themselves and what they say about the culture of that period. So I have one of these right here. One of the really interesting covers that kind of got me very curious about this era is this one. This is a record by Kang Ding. Yeah, and if you look at it closely, there's like a electric guitar. It's probably a cheap Japanese electric guitar, and there's a bongo drum, and he's wearing a sombrero, a Mexican hat, which is very odd. Or at least I thought so when I first saw it. And then, his fashion sense with a kind of, I don't know, Vegas Loudon singer lame gold suit, and then a rose and a tie with cobwebs on it. It's all very weird from our perspective, right? And then your task as a kind of cultural historian is to figure out why it looks like that, and how we can possibly understand these visual images, right? So I think that visual aspect is really, really key. So in this case, well, Kang Ding, he was from Lugang in southern Taiwan, but his whole kind of persona as a movie actor and as a singer was based on a Mexican, very famous Mexican actor called Cantinflas. So Kang Ding Falas. So the Kang Ding in his name is from Cantinflas, right? So you can kind of see in his persona, a sort of local inflection of Cantinflas, but also echoes of the American ascendancy in the sort of Elvis-like gold lame jacket, and also the material circulation of musical instruments in the Japanese made electric guitar. And all they speak to both the physical material scene of music making, but also the global circulation of images of movie stars or pop stars, and how then they're very cleverly and intentionally brought together in a kind of bricolage by Taiwanese artists. So for Kang Ding, for instance, I think one of the reasons he was interested in Cantinflas is Cantinflas always played a peasant figure who moves from the countryside to Mexico City, and then kind of through guile and humor and street smarts makes his way in the big city. And basically all of Kang Ding's movies, as well as a lot of Wen Sha's movies, are about the same thing. They're about people from the countryside who take the train up to Taipei, or in some cases, down to Kaohsiung, and then struggle to make it big in the city, right? So there's a reason why the image circulates from Mexico to Taiwan in this period. This is another example of visual imagery. This is the sorry, is that
It's
clear?
clear.
It's like
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it's a standard like insert sleeve for Asia Records. Yazhou Changpian that was based in Tainan that Hong Yifeng and Wen Sha recorded with. And this is like the American pinup girl, the blonde bombshell, but she's holding a violin. And it's an image that I think speaks to the dominance of Hollywood culture in that period, but also actually the military circulation, because we know that in American GI culture, the kind of blonde pinup and the calendar girls of like Marilyn Monroe or Rita Hayworth were very much part of US military culture. So we can kind of see that imprinted here in the visual imagery. This record, I think, is from the early 60s, maybe late 1950s. So it kind of, again, speaks to the circulation of images that are dominant in US culture into Taiwan and the way that they're reappropriated by a Taiwanese record company to create a very local cottage industry in Taiyu Gechu that in fact are mostly Japanese melodies with Taiwanese lyrics. Yeah. So yeah, definitely the visual culture is fascinating and really important. Later on in the 70s, early 70s especially, a lot of Mandarin pop records like by Yao Surong or Deng Lijun have very heavy influence of like psychedelic graphics from late 1960s records from the US and England, which is kind of funny because like Yao Surong's music is not really very psychedelic, but the lettering and the colors definitely reflect that graphic design movement as it sort of diffuses out beyond the borders of London or New York or LA, San Francisco to places like Taipei.
Yeah, I just want to tell the audience that you can, of course, ask the question in the comment section. So don't be shy and do it. I will read the comments, of course. Maybe I have a question about there's someone that we didn't talk about a lot, just touching a bit on is Dong Lichun, so Teresa Teng,
Right.
and there is the last part of the book is about Teresa Teng, and in fact the sonic influence of Teresa Teng during the Cold War. So can you talk about this influence of the voice of Teresa Teng, also as a commodified object during this period, but afterwards also in the 70s, in the 80s also, the role of Teresa Teng as the voice of Taiwan during the Cold War, and also the voice of modernity in China in the 80s.
Yeah. So a lot of people know about this story and have told this story in various ways about how Deng Lijun, Teresa Teng becomes the sort of I don't know, battering ram, spearhead, pick your metaphor, who brings the older era or the older lineage of Shanghai-based Mandarin pop back into mainland China after many years of being in exile because of the kind of socialist embargo on that kind of music. So yeah, I also retell that story, but I retell it from a somewhat more media studies or media infrastructure based angle, as well as also a more musical angle in one particular sense. So the chapter starts also, with the fact that Deng Lijun was called on repeatedly, actually, by the nationalist government as a propaganda mouthpiece, quite literally. She, on 2 occasions, went to Jinmen, or Quemoy, the island of Jinmen, which is just 8 miles off the coast of mainland China, to speak into the military-grade broadcast system that was part of a kind of hanhua, or sloganeering stations that were yelling at each other and broadcasting music at each other across the water on both sides of the strait. So she was directly implicated in the kind of military, installations of the Cold War. People also talk about the way that her cassettes were sometimes, dropped on the shore of Fujian, sometimes by balloon, right? But that's actually a pretty minor part of the story in the sense that what happens later on is that through the medium of audio cassettes and the boombox, the portable audio cassette recorder, her voice kind of breaks the monopoly of socialist music culture, red songs, in the late 70s. First through the medium of people listening surreptitiously to enemy radio, as it was called, but then through the kind of very rapid scale up of portable domestic appliances in the late 70s and early 80s in China. So, that's not really an unknown story at all. But what really interested me about this is how when people in mainland China talk about their first encounter with her, they're really fascinated with her voice in particular, right? And one thing that is really interesting to realize about Deng Lijun, now she's iconic, right? And perhaps even more popular and more iconic in mainland China than she is in Taiwan in a lot of ways. But when she first appeared in China, she was heard but not seen, right? People couldn't see her on TV. They couldn't see her in a magazine. She wasn't ubiquitous in advertisements or on television as she always had been in Taiwan. She became famous in Taiwan with the introduction of color television in 1968. But in China, she was heard but not seen. And she was heard in particular in a new way, rather than the kind of public broadcasting system that people had become inured to in the 1960s and 70s. Suddenly they had a more private venue for listening, which was either radio sets or portable tape recorders, right? And suddenly you were listening alone or in your room or with a group of friends in an intimate setting, and you were listening to a voice that, unlike the big, massive choral music of the revolutionary era, had been close mic'd, right? So recorded so as to pick up all the intimacies of the body, of breath, of fluctuations, of a sense of corporeality, right? Of microtones, all the things you couldn't really hear when you were listening to like quotation songs or to Dong Fang Hong, to that kind of music. So people are really fascinated by the grain of her voice, by the projected femininity of that body that you could hear through a cassette tape recorder. Which, I mean, we don't think of those things as being high fidelity now, but with respect to the public loudspeakers that most people were listening to before, it was very high fidelity. It gave you a much better sense of kind of musical range and musical intimacy than before. So in the chapter, I kind of argue that Deng Lijun, at least with respect to mainland China, wasn't so much a person or a performer, but a household appliance, right? And I also make the argument that it's really in the late 70s and 80s that transistor culture or transistorized portable electronics make their way to China and kind of dissolve the hard, large state networks that had kind of kept the sound system or the, sonic infrastructure of China in thrall, and suddenly changed the entire media landscape, and brought in or paved the way for an explosion of different kinds of pop music later on. Yeah.
I think it's quite well captured by, I think it's in the movie Youth by Feng Xiaogong. That at the end there you have this just at the end of the Cultural Revolution, this armies, kids are listening to a cassette tape of of Teresa Teng, and it symbolized the end of the Cultural Revolution, of course, and
Yeah.
also the new intimacy that is brought by the voice of Dong Lijun, which is really
Right. The main
interesting, I
character
think.
only falls in love after he hears.
Yeah,
So yeah, so that's interesting, and we also see it in Jia Dongke's film "Zhantai," which
yeah,
starts with people listening secretly to a transistor radio to Deng Lijun. Um, yeah, so I also sort of I'm a little bit skeptical or a little bit dubious about those narratives, um, in the sense that nowadays it's become a those scenes of listening to Deng Lijun become the watershed between socialism and capitalism, between collectivism and individualism, between revolutionary sacrifice and romance. Yeah, and I don't think actually the boundary or the cut is as neat as those stories would indicate, but definitely she's become iconic in that sense. Yeah. You do also read stories of people who heard her music in the 70s and hated it, right? And thought, oh my God, this is everything we fought the revolution against. it's it really is too bourgeois and too soft and actually too syrupy. So I don't think the reaction was uniform or immediate, but it certainly has become a watershed sonically speaking. Yeah.
yeah. But even in Taiwan, during the military dictatorship, you had a lot of censorship of
Yes.
this kind of songs, like with the emotions, with the sensibility. For example, Yao Xuzhong, which is one of the very important singer, where she was called the Queen of Ben song. So about 100 songs of her were banned because of the sentimentality. So it's not only in the PRC. You had the same in Taiwan, where like showing too much, sentimentality or emotions could mean that you were banned or censored. So it's interesting
Yeah,
to see
no,
that.
and that's definitely true. And well, we can certainly draw some historical lineages between crackdowns on so-called, uh, yellow music from the KMT era in China, from the Republican period onto both, the nationalist regime in Taiwan and the communist um, cultural regime. Yeah, I mean the first kind of banning of Li Jinghui's music was came from the KMT stronghold in Nanchang in Jiangxi province. Yeah, and was part of the New Life movement. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I have another question on the chat. So Alice, I was wondering about the possible specificity of musical brokers or middlemen in this period, beside what has been said about the military. So record producers, for example, who were they? Can we identify some specific profiles among them in these different areas? So about the brokers and the middlemen of
Mhm.
kind of music.
Sure. That's a great question. If we're talking about Taiwan, then um, well, in the chapter about pirate history, I start off with a sort of joke about pirate history, but it's not really a joke, which is pirates don't really write their don't write their own histories because they are doing something that's illegal or surreptitious. So it's sometimes a little hard to recover who exactly the brokers or actors were. But I do profile one particular company called Di Tangpian, First Records, which was started by a businessman named Ye Jintai. Ye Jintai, sorry, and he's totally fascinating, a really interesting character, who was educated under the Japanese colonial period, and then worked as a mining engineer in near Jiufen, the famous Jiufen in northeast Taiwan, um, actually in Shifen Liao. And then he figured out how to use mining tailings to make plastics, Bakelite in particular, and made a fortune like making Bakelite, um, what do you call it, like insulation for phone networks and wiring, and then like milk bottles, water bottles. And because he was in plastics, he got into making vinyl and then started this company. Not because he was interested in music, but because he was interested in plastic. Um, and First Records then became one of the best and the biggest pirate companies, and then were able to parlay the capital that they had made in that business into retooling and starting one of the largest optical media companies in the world. So when CDs and DVDs and CD-ROMs were king, his company, which was an offshoot of First Records called Rytech, became one of the world's largest manufacturers of CD-ROMs and DVDs and CDs in the world. So that's one kind of middleman, which is like business history in Taiwan, and really, really fascinating. I guess that company has now been outmoded by digital streaming and, the end of the CD. But for a time, they were really, really huge. Other kind of middle men or middle women that I could identify were, both soldiers as consumers, but also, as I mentioned before, air hostesses who were flying the route between the west coast of the US and Taipei, for like Northwest Airlines, and sometimes also flying from like Taiwan to Vietnam or Taiwan to Japan, and could bring records in. And then, the local business people can then look at Billboard magazine or see what's popular, and then publish those records pretty quickly through piracy. So that's another kind of actor or broker. Moving up the kind of pyramid a little bit, you also had some really interesting DJs and also artists and tastemakers who helped introduce rock music in a serious way to, the文艺青年, the hipsters and the artists and the sort of more advanced intellectuals of this period. So one person who stands out in particular as a middleman of musical taste, and especially of mediating the serious introduction of rock as art music into Taiwan, is Zhang Zhaotang, the great photographer, an artist who's still going strong today. And he wrote a series of articles about Van Morrison and Bob Dylan in the press of Taiwan in the early mid-70s that were really influential. He also ran a series of I think he called them like rock dinners, where he'd basically have a salon and play a series of records, and they had a menu of the records, and then he'd write synopses of each of the records for the people who came to the rock salon or the rock dinner. And that kind of diffused a lot of insider knowledge about what was going on in London or in New York, to a kind of eager audience of intellectuals and musicians in Taiwan in the early 70s. Yeah. There was also publishers who would publish his work, like the magazine, what was it called? Music in Stereo. Yeah.
Yeah. But very interesting, because it's in my mind, I draw parallels between Taiwan in the 70s and 60s and China in the 90s. These kind of things also have some parallels, because, like, for example, in Taiwan, the beginning of rock music in the 50s, it was through the militaries and the military kids. And in fact, we can see that in the 90s, with the creation of Chinese punk music, you had a lot of children of the militaries that were involved, because they had more freedom and were less subjected to repression that came into the music scene. And you can also see the fanzines and the magazines that introduced music, Western music in China was also, through radio shows and through some magazines that had some section about I think it was Yao Gun Dui Hua, so conversation about rock and roll. So it's really interesting that you can see some parallels between different eras, like the 60s and the 70s in Taiwan and the 80s and the 90s in China, which is really interesting, I think.
Yeah, isn't there's a story about one of the earliest kind of rock fans in China going back to the 60s, who was a PLA
Yeah.
a privileged PLA kid. Yeah, right.
Yeah, you have a lot of kind of these stories, because sometimes the kids of the PLA were more aware of foreign stuffs because they had access to this.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I've also heard stories about privileged college students in like Beida who were the first kids to hear Beatles records because there were some like radical French students who were in Beida at that time and brought the records with them. So yeah, it definitely depended on access to um, experiences and materials that most people didn't have, for sure.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, there is a part of a book called Lost Generation by Michel Bonin on the Sendon youth that were sent on in the Guangzhou area,
Mm.
and they could listen to Hong Kong radio for the shortwave, and they listened to pop music, Hong Kong pop music and Western pop music, and they copied the music, and they were singing like the Beatles during their Sendon youth era. So that's also kind of interesting to see that also the circuit is not as closed as we want to think about during the Cultural Revolution.
Oh, definitely. There's always exceptions and like places in between the mesh. Yeah, that you can squeeze through. Mm.
So yeah, thank you, Andrew Jones, for this very fascinating talk and discussion about your new book. So I think we're gonna end here because it's been 2 hours, and maybe you want to rest a bit. I think it's 9 p.m. at your place. And again, so Circuit Listening, that was published in 2020, so you can still find it, and that's a great read. So I encourage everyone to read Circuit Listening after this talk. Thank you so much, Andrew Jones, for coming to this webinar from
Thank you so
California.
much. It was a really fun conversation, and thank you for all those who are listening along with us.
Yes.
Yeah, great.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm gonna stop the live recording. So thanks everyone.